It's great to be alive and love. Good, good morning, sun. Good morning, life. Good morning, sun. How are you? Skies above. Gee, it's great to be alive and love. Good morning, sun. Good morning, sun.
And good morning. Hope you are doing well. This is being recorded on Sunday morning, and hope you have some coffee. It is 7 o'clock, 7:10 out here in Los Angeles, and I know that Jeremy Viska has been streaming on his channel from Sweden. So it is a busy day for Business Central content. So cheers. And thank you, Microsoft, for the conference swag. I forget what conference that was from, but it was pretty cool. Handy cup. So I haven't streamed in a while, haven't done a video in a little while. And so let me adjust some lights. I wanted to share what I've been working on, and I'm kind of at a not a roadblock, but kind of a point where I need to change what I'm doing in order to move to the next phase of my Business Central development learning. And I I didn't plan out this far ahead, so I didn't anticipate this, but it's an interesting situation to be in. So let's take a look at this. Oh, well, let me go back. So the point is, how should I go about learning Business Central development? And you might think, well, okay, I'll just take some type of online training, or I'll do this, or I'll do that. And maybe you have a book, maybe you have the AL for Beginners workbook, or maybe you found a few blog posts and you think, I'm going to become a Business Central AL developer. I can relate, been there. And that's great up until a point. And it may be great for a given topic, or it might be great for a handful of topics to get you to a very, very basic or minimal level. And my question is, what comes after that? What comes after the studying or the textbooks, or the hands-on workbook or the labs? What do you do next? How do you become proficient? And so that's the question I have right now that I'm working through. So there is absolutely no shortage of material that you could use to learn. I mean, this is just in 2 minutes, I pulled all this together. I started with the Programming in AL for Beginners workbook because it was very simple. Christoph did an excellent job only covering the basics, and he didn't attempt to explain everything. He didn't attempt to kind of go into any of the quirks or side topics. He said, hey, you're a beginner. Here's what you need to know just to get started. And it is fantastic for that. But as you go along, you're probably going to have other questions. So you might pull up a book. So here's Programming for Microsoft 365 Business Central, a very handy book for digging into other topics. Oops. And there's Mastering Business Central. There are a couple other books. There is the MS Learn, what do they call them? Learning paths and modules, something like that. And so you could do those. I've looked at a few of those, and honestly, I don't know that I have the patience, because it looks like it's just you read a slide, next, or you read a few sentences or a couple of paragraphs, next. Maybe there's a few videos interspersed there, but the few that I've glanced at, it looks like it requires a fair amount of patience, and so I need to look at those again to see if I can get value out of them. And then you might think, well, hey, people like Eric and Jeremy and others, they have videos that I can watch. Yes, but many of those are small, short, or they're discrete topics. And how many of those videos would you have to watch in order to get a bigger picture? And not all of them follow a specific learning path. So Eric will pick a very neat topic, talk about it. So maybe he'll talk about protected storage, or maybe he'll talk about calling a web service, or talk about a more advanced feature, a new feature. And so for a beginner, sometimes those are more difficult to follow for me. I'll watch them to learn something, but I'm down here. He's talking about here. So there's a gap, and I need to slowly build up my skills from the bottom and get those fundamental skills handled. So, how do I do that? Okay. Well, there's this guy, Steve. He created this handy list of Business Central resources. Well, that was great at first. It gets you oriented. If you knew nothing about Business Central, well, where do I start? Oh, cool. There's help pages and documentation. And here's some blogs and Twitter accounts I can follow. It helps you build a kind of a picture of Business Central. But now, helpful as he has been, there are over 190 resources on this blog post. And if you scroll through it, it's kind of overwhelming. And yes, you can exclude the Twitter users, you can exclude the YouTube channels, and you could even exclude the blog posts. And you're left with a nice core set of resources to refer to. But it's not structured. It's just a directory, like walking into a building and seeing a directory of every office, or looking at the index of a book. It's a fairly long list. So no longer a great starting point, I will admit, for someone who's new. It's like, okay, here's a place to go if I want to try to find something, maybe. It's not really structured. It's not a step-by-step guide. It's not here's where to look to get started anymore. But it does have some good resources. So what do you learn? I think I had to start after just kind of randomly focusing on things and learning certain things. There's a lot of stuff out there. There are a lot of topics or subtopics related to Business Central. What do you focus on? Docker, APIs, testing, queries, architecture, language, all of these, this word cloud, word salad, like you need to start to focus on something so that you're not, I'm finding that I'm scattered. It's like, okay, wow, there's AL pages. Oh, there's APIs. And what about, let's see, automated testing? And so I was bouncing around among all these topics, and it wasn't this nice linear learning path. Admittedly, those learning paths probably do exist, but I'm kind of impatient, and I see something shiny and it's like, ooh, shiny. Web APIs, cool. Automated testing, cool. DevOps, really cool, right? So you tend to bounce around based on whatever you just happen to come across, a blog, a video, a training course, whatever. So this is great. It looks really neat, but it is not necessarily a productive way to learn, for me at least. So my learning process so far that I've actually tried to follow, I initially said, well, let me learn Docker because Docker is going to be the foundation for having a development environment. So I took a workshop that Waldo taught at Directions NA. Gosh, I think it was like 2 or 3 years ago. I think it was in San Diego. Took that workshop, was, wow, that's amazing. Let me get Docker installed on my laptop. Nope, did not work. It absolutely crushed my poor i5 laptop with only 8 gigs of RAM, and I was using hotel Wi-Fi like 2 hours later, and it was still struggling to download the Docker images at the time. You know, those little parts, it's constantly retrying and failing. So I fought with Docker for months, and so I thought, okay, well, this seems like a good place to learn. So I eventually just said, okay, buy a brand new machine, build a brand new machine, high end, get Windows Server installed, get Docker Enterprise installed. And I slowly tackled this list here and got BC Container or Nav Container Helper, BC Container Helper working. I learned about BC Docker containers, so I had just minimal competence and was comfortable creating them, working with them. Then I realized, well, I really kind of need to finally invest in PowerShell, understand how to use it to the extent that I need it to manage these Docker containers. So I did that. I learned a little bit about FLF license files, and through the Programming in AL for Beginners workbook, I got to a point where I could get to the AL Go Basic Hello World project. Fantastic. So that's where I was at. So that gets you to a development environment and Hello World. That's a great milestone. I don't want to minimize that because that took me, let's say, 2 years to kind of get focused, and then roughly 6 months of, and this is all part-time for me. I have essentially two different day jobs I'm juggling, so this is all part-time in my free time and spare time. So I got to AL Go, and that was a big accomplishment. So now that I'm there, what next? So some colleagues and I said, well, we need to focus. We need to have some focus studying to get to the next level. It's hard to dabble at this at 10, 15, 30 minutes at a time. So we took an entire week and we allocated 7 a.m. to 10 p.m. for 5 days. It was a Saturday through Wednesday, 7 a.m. on Saturday all the way through Wednesday at 10 p.m. We studied and we came up with a curriculum. I think I have a list in here, but this is what we essentially got through during that time. We looked at what we had. We had a lot of difficult topics, and we had a lot of basic topics. And my colleague said, well, I want to start with the most difficult concept, the most difficult content that we can, and then I want to move down to the easy content. And I thought, wow, that's interesting. That's actually opposite of what I would have done. I would have started easy with the basics and moved up to the difficult stuff. But it turned out to be, I think, a really good strategy. It was really productive. It turned out that the most difficult topic wasn't necessarily, or what we thought was the largest, most difficult topic, wasn't necessarily the most difficult. It was just more intimidating. We thought it was bigger. But once you break it down into tiny bite-sized pieces or baby steps, whatever metaphor you want to use, we were able to digest it, we were able to discuss it, to learn it, and we weren't experts at the topic, but we got to a point where we felt, okay, we get the concept, we can work with this, and we can then move to learn the actual, mechanics of this topic. So automated testing. We started with Luc Van Vuet's book, Automated Testing in Business Central. It's kind of the Bible of automated testing. There are other resources for this, which I found later during our studying, but his book is very comprehensive, and it discusses not just the mechanics, but the philosophy, the mindset, the entire approach around it. If you attempt to just do automated testing for an existing project or new project, you can write that code, but it won't be acceptance test driven development, or ATDD, as he explains. And I think that's really important. Once you read chapters 1 through 4, you understand it's like, it's not just how to do it, it's why to do it and why it's so difficult to implement that philosophy, the ATDD philosophy, and what you really need in terms of infrastructure and practices and just the way you talk about it, the way you describe it, justify it, budget it, etc. It's a pretty big thing to take on. It's an entirely different philosophy of development. So now I have since found videos that discuss the pros and cons of those. So I would take a look, just search on YouTube test-driven development, and there's some really good videos and conference talks about what are the challenges of test-driven development, and not just the philosophical arguments against it, but what are the real-world practical problems you're going to run into, even if you're just a huge advocate of test-driven development. Some really interesting points of the complexities that you'll get into if you're a very heavy test-driven development environment. So we got through that. We were stoked. That was the first, I think, day and a half. And I thought that would take a week. And we stopped at chapter 4 because it would have taken a week for us to get through the entire book. We then said, great, we're at a point where we think we can independently learn the subsequent chapters. So let's move on to Azure DevOps. And my colleague found that chapter 8 of the Business Central cookbook had a chapter from scratch walking through, okay, set up this project, set up Azure DevOps, and build your Docker containers, build your project, and you have a pipeline from building your BC container helper or nav container helper, automatically with the YAML pipeline, building your project from Git. It pulls the code in, builds it, submits it to the Docker container, and I think it did call test routines, but it kind of stopped there. So it didn't go all the way through to a SaaS deployment. But excellent chapter, walked us through the process, showed us some YAML. We didn't have a ton of success in modifying that YAML a lot to do other things, but we're able to modify our BC container helper script with the new version, different parameters. We're able to add a license file, add the test toolkit, and kind of modify how the Docker container was set up and build our project. So that was really eye-opening. And from that, I didn't expect to become a master, but it did allow me to have a list of questions ready for the DevOps course that I'm taking starting next week with Waldo, Eric Waters. So he's hosting that course. I think it's the second time he's offered that course. So I'll be taking that next week, and it's over the course of 2 weeks. I think it's 4 classes spread out over 2 weeks. So that was great. It got me oriented, so I won't be absolutely clueless during the headlights trying to figure out what's going on during the course, I hope. Who knows? I may still be, but I at least understand some of the basics. I understand how to create my Azure DevOps account, set up a pipeline, have the build agents. I have a local build agent on my server so that I'm not having to pay for Azure. So really eye-opening. So we got through that with just chapter 8, which did take a couple days. So we said, great. That was our second big hurdle. So next up on our list, we skipped a few things. We jumped to tables, pages, and queries. Kind of the fundamental building blocks of the Business Central AL language. And for that, we looked at this book just kind of as a learning guide. It's more the academic description of what these things are. And it wasn't any hands-on coding. So that was Programming Dynamics 365 Business Central, 6th edition. There are several editions. So we went through that. And there are a lot of, I think, still references to the nav and seaside concepts, which is fine. But there were a lot of questions like, okay, why was this described this way? Or why are these properties set up? Are they really relevant for the SaaS world? But we understood the concepts of tables, pages, and queries. I don't have all the properties memorized. There are, 10 different page types and 50 different permutations of how you can assemble them, but I get it, right? If you've done development, you get the concept, you see the screenshots, and you understand how these pieces might be used. So that was really helpful. So we have this fundamental academic knowledge of automated testing, Azure DevOps, table pages, and queries. And so I understand these concepts. But what is next? Okay, I kind of know about DevOps. I kind of know about automated testing. I'm familiar with these things called tables, pages, and queries. What do I do with this information? And I can read a chapter about intermediate AL. I can read about extension development. I can take these MS Learn courses over here and learn about the AL programming language, essential development standards, interfacing with Business Central. Okay, I can watch. Should I start from the beginning of Jeremy Visca's Beginning Corporation live stream, where he starts with his requirements and he starts building out this big project? Maybe that's valuable because I'll pick up coding tips and practical discussion of design philosophy and how he went about designing the bots and the configuration and the game that he's building. But, that's hours of watching him to pick up tidbits of learning and knowledge and nuggets of his experience doing development. Valuable, but is that the best curriculum to follow or route to follow to actually learn? Or should I take a look at Mark Brummel's AL design patterns? And I don't know when these are last updated, but I just happened to stumble across these. Should I take a look at the al.masterdata.person design pattern to pick up tips in terms of how to design AL? I don't know. There's a lot of resources out there. So then I thought, well, during our learning week, one of the things that we talked about was, well, maybe we should define a project and start from there rather than just learning these topics or tidbits in a scattered or isolated fashion. Maybe we should define a project so that we have context, just like Jeremy has created the Beginning Corporation as the basis for his live stream, for learning, for AL development, for a game. It is a story, it's a narrative. So maybe we need a narrative and we need to define a small project. And so as part of the discussions of the ATDD for Luke's book, I thought, well, how does that test-driven development, the acceptance test-driven development process work? And I came up with this, for lack of a better concept, a pyramid. So I have some need or some problem. I have a business requirement, and that's in the general sense. Well, someone, I forget who on Twitter, recommended, I use the term requirements gathering, and he pointed out to me that there's an entire industry of business analysts and business analyst certification. Just like there's the PMI and PMP certifications, there is a business analyst certification, and there's a book called the BABOK, B-A-B-O-K, I believe. And he explained to me, was it Daniel? I don't remember. He explained to me that there is a term that is industry standard called requirements elicitation. So that's why I mentioned that here. If you're not familiar with that term, requirements elicitation, that is a very specific term used by the business analyst, the formal business analyst industry. So you have a business need, you say, I need this solution, and you use the requirements elicitation process to elicit the requirements from the business user, because they don't necessarily know. It's not like they know exactly what they need, and you're not gathering requirements. You're not picking them up off the ground. You have to elicit them from the business users and the business overall. You take those requirements, and I'm kind of improvising here. You develop a solution design, for lack of a better term, my lack of a better term. And based on that design, you'll have a story. You'll have a story that ties to those requirements. And it may be a narrative. It may be user personas. And from that story, you're developing test stories. And this is where this pyramid meets up with Luke's book on acceptance test driven development. So you'll have test stories so that you can have narratives about how you design your test code. And so we realized, well, we were reading Luke's book. We thought, great, let's write a test. We sat there in front of a blank AL file and we said, how do we write a test? What are we testing for? And we realized, well, without the test story, you can't start coding test before you start coding actual code. So that was fascinating. So that's why I came up with this. Test code comes later in the process. There's actually all this work that comes before you can even have test code, let alone real code. So we have our test stories that leads to test code that leads to code. So anyway, that's the backstory of how I think I need to go from learning these academic concepts from books, from videos, from tutorials, from online learning courses to actually writing code. And that, I think, is how I transitioned from student to practitioner, just by going through this process. So I have a concept for a small project, and I'm deciding whether to work through that or come up with something simpler. But requirements, design, tests, code, and that can move on to DevOps, which is what this is right here. So that's the concept of how I'm thinking I will move to the next step and actually practice. It'll be less a question of what do I learn next and more of how do I move to practitioner, start writing code, because I can keep reading books and talking about AL queries and AL pages and developing an API page. And maybe there are best practices and standards for how you write AL. But until I start typing, it's not going to really gel and I won't be able to digest it. So that's what I'm thinking. That's what I think is next. And I will start moving through this process. I won't just jump to it. I'll just start at the need problem, requirements elicitation, solution design, and see if I can go through the practice of acceptance. I keep wanting to say automated, but it's acceptance test-driven development all the way through code, which then creates my solution, which pushes into a DevOps pipeline. So it'll be a pretty big arc, but I think I can get there. Jeremy is going through that process himself, but he's an experienced developer. So I'll be going through that process as a newbie, someone who has no idea what they're doing. And rather than just jumping into code, I'm going to try to work through this entire pyramid. And if someone has a better metaphor, a better formal practice, whether it's the BABOK, the PMI, PMP, whatever, formal industry standard or enterprise grade metaphor for this is, I'm open to it. Maybe I do own the BABOK, so maybe I need to look through that book and see if there is a formal methodology for this practice. So anyway, that's what I'm up to. And I have a couple other things I'm working on. But for now, have a great weekend and enjoy.